So one of the most common questions I get asked at Axminster is, how do I sharpen a plane blade? How do I sharpen a chisel? My first response to this is buy yourself a honing guide. These things allow you to get quick, consistent and reliable results with minimal effort, because at the end of the day, it's much more fun making blades blunt than it is sharpening them. So in this video, I'm going to talk you through 3 of the most common honing guides on the market, and hopefully by the end of it, you will know which one will suit your needs better. Welcome to Tool Duel. Tool Duel. What a dreadful name. There's no point having you all the way back there. Let's get the camera in close. Okay, so firstly, let me give you a brief overview of all 3 honing guides. These 2 here are Eclipse style honing guides, and they are given that name because they're actually based off an old pattern called an Eclipse, or an old model called an Eclipse, sorry. These basically work by clamping the blade on the side like that, and you are ready to hone. This one here is a cheaper model by Axminster under their Rider brand, but it's actually a basic pattern that lots of manufacturers are producing nowadays, so nothing too special about that. Bog standard, gets the job done. Costs about £10 for it. This one here is the Lie-Nielsen Eclipse honing guide. So again, clamps on the side. Much better machining on this, and it has a few extra features that I'll talk you through in a minute. This one retails for roughly £110. Finally, the Veritas one. This one throws all of the traditional rules of honing guides out the windows, and they have just done their complete own thing on it. So this works by, firstly, you've got this protrusion stop on the front, which is detachable. So I have a blade here that is 2 3/8 thick, I think. So I'm going to set that to 2 3/8 here. So there's a scale on the top that I can read off. And then on this protrusion arm, there's lots of numbers written on it in different colours. So I usually sharpen my blades to 30 degrees on the secondary bevel. So on this arm, I can see it says 30 degrees. It's written in yellow. So firstly, I'm going to set my stop to 30 degrees on that point. And because it's written in yellow, I need to ensure that on the top of the honing guide here, that is on number 2, which is also yellow. So with that all set, all I need to do, flip the honing guide over, pop the blade in underneath, and on this protrusion arm, there's a fence that I need to push the blade up against to keep it square, and then I need to slide it up and butt it against the protrusion stop here. So that's all held in place now. I can clamp it down. And this is one of the main differences with the Veritas one, in that it clamps the blade on the top. So bear that in mind, because that's going to come up a lot later on. And with that all clamped down, I can then remove the protrusion arm, and voila, like magic, that is at 30 degrees and ready to hone. Now furthermore, this Veritas honing guide has a cam wheel on the bottom. So what that means is that when it's at 30 degrees, you can polish your bevel like that. And then if you say take it from a 6,000 to a 10,000 grit stone, instead of putting it at exactly the same angle and have to polish the entire secondary bevel, you can pivot this cam wheel 180 degrees, which actually lifts the blade up ever so slightly more, and you can actually polish a tertiary bevel on it. So you're probably thinking now, bloody hell, well, it's a no-brainer, I'll just go out and buy one of these. That does everything. It's got its protrusion stops, it's got its cam wheel on the bottom, it's got all these different angles it can do. It can do high angles, standard angles, back bevels. It does the lot apparently. But there is one major flaw with this honing guide. It's fiddly. Look at it. Adjustment there, adjustment there, adjustment there, adjustment there, adjustment there, adjustment there. There is a lot to do on this, whereas an Eclipse honing guide, it's just all done with that. Sharpening is boring, well, at least it is for me anyway. I want to spend as little time at the sharpening station as possible, and if I'm faffing about setting up all these stops on here, granted, yes, you leave a lot of them in the same position as you did last time, but you still have to clamp these 2 to get the blade in place. You've still got to get this protrusion all sorted, and it's just, I have always found this a little bit too fiddly for my liking. So, with that little rant over, I just wanted to get that out of the way before you went off and bought one of these things and closed the video. Let me show you how you can make these Eclipse honing guides perform the same, if not better, than this Veritas one at basic sharpening tasks. So firstly, how do you replicate the protrusion stop on the Veritas MK.II? The answer to that is make your own protrusion stop. So this has all of the most common angles that I use, and the way to use this is simply pop your blade in the honing guide, nip it up a little bit, slide it up against there, voila. Done. So I'll just lock that in place. That is at 30 degrees, ready to go. Secondly, this Veritas one has the cam wheel on the bottom that allows you to ever so slightly change the angle of the blade to the stone. Now these Eclipse style honing guides do not have that cam wheel, so how do you mimic that? Again, bring your protrusion stop out. So the blade is at 30 degrees right now, so I've sharpened that on my 6000 grit stone. Now I want to raise the angle ever so slightly and polish the very edge of it. All I'm going to do is pop the shim there, loosen the honing guide a bit, and there we go. Pop that on there, clamp it up. That has changed the angle of the blade ever so slightly, lifted it up, and now I can polish a tertiary bevel on the end of that. So there we go. That's how Eclipse style honing guides can replicate a Veritas at very basic functions. But we're not done there yet. There is lots of other things that these honing guides can do, and I will talk you through that now. Now before I go any further, this video is obviously titled Lie-Nielsen honing guide versus Veritas MK.II honing guide. Why have I got this one in here, the cheaper one? Well, I just wanted to show you the issue with this compared to the Lie-Nielsen one, so I can just eradicate this from it, because at the end of the day, these two are premium honing guides. This is a budget one. If you're sharpening freehand, but you don't want to splash out on one of these, I will say it now, get one of these, because it will just save you so much time. The amount of blades that get bought into Axminster where they have 50 different facets on here, they've got a round edge, they've got chips taken off them because the user has been sharpening them freehand. It's just a very sorry sight to see. So get yourself one of these, make yourself a protrusion stop. But the issue with these ones is when you are clamping blades in them and you tighten it down, what's happened is these jaws underneath have actually splayed out like this. And what that has done is actually thrown the blade slightly out of square to the stone. Now this isn't much of a problem on wider blades such as plain blades, because you can just hone it like that and just keep the pressure even on each corner. But when you start working on narrower chisels, if it throws it out ever so slightly, it's very easy to polish an angle on the edge of the chisel, which isn't great. So that's where the Lie-Nielsen one is better, in that the machining is much more accurate and those jaws do not splay out whatsoever. So let's get this out the shot and we'll just compare the two premium honing guides. So let's go through a quick disadvantage of the Eclipse style honing guide. And that comes with when you're using odd shaped blades. So this is the Veritas NX60. It's a premium block plane. It's actually the same pattern as their DX60. And the difference with these is that their blades are not square. Where this taper goes in, it's actually only clamping on this blade at the last 5 millimeters. And this becomes even worse as that blade gets shorter. By the time I've taken 3 millimeters off this blade in a few years' time, this will not be able to clamp properly in these standard jaws. It's kind of getting away from it now, but it's still a little bit precarious. So this is the main difference between a premium Eclipse style honing guide and a budget one like this. These jaws on top are removable. You see these screws? If I take those off, you can then buy different jaws for the Lie-Nielsen honing guide to suit different tasks. So these ones here are the long jaws, and I would definitely recommend buying these because in most cases they can actually just replace these standard ones. And on these jaws you have 2 locating pins, and then opposite those you have 2 screws. And it's worth mentioning that these screws are captive. You cannot lose them, which is great because I always do stuff like that. Veritas one, all the screws on it are loose. So you see, they all come out and then you can just drop them wherever you want. So yeah, locating pin locates in there, as you would expect. Then all you do is tighten those down. Okay, so they're all clamped in place now. And what I can do is pop my premium Veritas blade in there with its weird shape. Slide that up against the 30-degree stop. And there we go. I've got far more support down the length of that blade now. Holds it all in place securely. And that is all good. Now, like I say, I leave these long jaws in most of the time because they can still accommodate my larger plain blades like this. You know, set that to the 30-degree stop. Bang, that's still working with the long jaws fitted. The only limitation you have with the long jaws is when you start going to angles such as 50 degrees, because you can't actually protrude the blade out far enough beyond the jaws. So that's the only limitation. If you're sharpening 50 degrees and stuff often, then the long jaws might not be a good solution for you. The other advantage of the long jaws is spoke shave blades. We all know how much of a nightmare it is to sharpen these. So get that nipped up, get my protrusion stop, voila. I can now easily sharpen my spoke shave blades. Lovely. Now the Veritas one, because it clamps on the top, it doesn't matter about this profile on the blades. it's always going to hold it in place, and obviously they wouldn't make a honing guide that doesn't fit on their tools. So there you go, that's all clamped in place. So there we go, there's a small disadvantage with the Eclipse honing guide. If you do have weird shaped blades like that, you're going to need extra jaws, and likewise if you need sharpened spoke shave blades, you're also going to need these extra jaws. However, let me show you an issue with the Veritas, which is something that a lot of people have faced, and I've seen it come up time and time again in store. And that issue is with sharpening chisels. So I won't bother setting the protrusion, I'll just get it all in place. Now I'm making sure that these jaws are clamping down evenly to start with. I'm really going to wrench these down. So that is properly tight now. Now that can still slide about in there, believe it or not. And that is because it clamps on the top instead of the side, like these Eclipse honing guides. So like I mentioned before, the issue with this cheaper one is that it throws the blade out of square to the stone when you tighten it down. This Veritas one does exactly the same. It can tighten these down all you want. By the time you've done a few strokes on the stone, that can easily shift. Now this is a 3/4 inch chisel. This gets so much more worse when you take it down to 1/4 inch and 1/8 inch chisels. They slide all over the place in there. So what Veritas have done is brought out the narrow blade attachment. To get this on, all you do is unscrew this head. Be careful not to lose that bit, and then that simply attaches to the top like that. And that has converted this honing guide from a top clamping honing guide to a side clamping one. It's all done on this adjustment here. Now this is still quite fiddly to set up, so I'm just going to clamp this protrusion arm on here. Basically the way to do this is to get this protrusion arm on, but not locked in place, so it can still sort of slide side to side like that. Flip it over, butt your chisel up against the protrusion stop. And this is why you kind of want to be able to slide that protrusion arm still, because you need to sort of follow the path of the chisel as it gets clamped on the side like that. So just going to keep it all lined up like that. You've just got to work the two parts in unison. There we go. Take that off. And now that is locked in there. So that is the advantage with the side clamping one. It's very good that Veritas have brought this out, because that was a major issue with this top clamping head. Now with that in mind, let me show you where another disadvantage with the Lie-Nielsen one is. When you have 1/8 inch blades like that, with the Veritas one, you can simply get that 1/8 inch chisel in place, all locked down, and that is in there rock solid. However, with the Lie-Nielsen one, let me just get this all closed up. Because of the extremely steep dovetail ratio, if you try and clamp 1/8 inch chisels in here, the top closes before it's able to properly clamp the chisel in place. So look, I can slide that forward and backwards in here. And that's the case with both the long jaws and the standard jaws. So if you're sharpening 1/8 inch chisels, you are going to need separate chisel jaws for this honing guide as well. So if you're sharpening 1/8 inch chisels quite often, that is obviously going to bump the price up of this honing guide even more, because you need those extra jaws. So other jaws available for this Lie-Nielsen guide are skew jaws. Now these are locked into 18 degrees and 30 degrees, and that pretty much covers all the skews on Lie-Nielsen's range. However, if you need access to even more skew angles, this Veritas one here will be a better option for you. What you can do is get a skew registration jig, which clamps on the front exactly the same as this protrusion guide, but it has lots of angles on it. And because this is top clamping, it means that you can pop your skew chisel in there, clamp it at whatever angle you want. So I don't know, say if you wanted a 45, you can clamp it in there and you can get honing like that. Another thing that you may have seen in the Veritas range is a camber wheel. So what this allows you to do is rock the honing guide from side to side, and that allows you to put a small curve or a large curve on the top of your plane blades. Now this has various benefits that I'll be showing you in a later video, but that attaches exactly how you would expect through this thumb wheel on top. So there you go, that is all locked down now, and that honing guide is now able to tip, and therefore I can put a small curve on the front of my plane blades. With the Lie-Nielsen one and the blade in place, you can still rock that side to some extent, and that allows you to put a camber on the edge of your blade, which is something I will be covering in a later video. Now this is where a lot of beginners especially see the advantage in having a wider wheel on a Veritas one, because it's much easier to keep that blade square to the stone when you're resting on a wide wheel like that, because it's much harder to tip. With a smaller wheel like this, it's much easier to accidentally roll the honing guide ever so slightly and put an angle on this. Now obviously over time and lots of practice, you can get into a knack of just keeping it nice and square on a narrow wheel like this. But bear in mind, if you're using the Veritas with a flat wheel and you're relying on that to keep your blades square, once you start wanting to put a curve on the edge of your blades, you will need to switch to the camber roller on these ones. And another quick advantage of the camber roller on this Veritas one is that you can sharpen scrub plane blades on it fairly easily because those have a massive camber on them. And also some shallow gouges as well I found that I can sharpen on this. This one here doesn't quite rock enough to be able to get the clearance on that. So, with that all covered, which one would I choose? I know I've been back and forth between all these different features, I've probably confused you quite a lot, but what suits my workflow best is the Lie-Nielsen with the long jaws fitted. The reason for that is that I do not want to be messed around with fiddling all these different knobs and stuff on these ones, trying to set it up. I want sharpening to be a quick process because it's much more fun making tools blunt than it is making them sharp. Secondly, to add to the fiddliness of this, having to switch between heads when sharpening plane blades versus sharpening chisels it's just a nightmare, to be honest. You may ask, can I just not have the narrow blade head permanently installed? No, you can't, because it only clamps up to 1.5 inches if I remember correctly, and plane blades are usually around 2 inches and above if you're working with number 4s and the standard sizes. So that's my main dislikes for the Veritas ones. Yes, I see it's extremely versatile, and I appreciate that if you were working with Skews and you had that skew registration jig, you have every angle at your disposal that way. Furthermore, if you're sharpening scrub plane blades and maybe shallow gouges, this would be great if fitted with the camber roller, but I just don't do that stuff. So that is why the Lie-Nielsen suits my workflow better. With this, I can clamp my plane blades, I can clamp my chisels, I can clamp my spoke shave blades. I can do everything with the long jaws attached to the top of this. The only limitation I have is when I want to put a 50-degree bevel on my low angle jack plane, for example, in which case I need to switch to the standard jaws. I can also put shallow cambers on my bench planes with this by slightly rocking it side to side. I don't need any huge sweeping curves with this whatsoever. This suits everything that I could possibly need. The only issue I have with this is when I'm sharpening my 1/8 inch chisel, which is there, because it's obviously very thin. I haven't purchased the chisel jaws yet because I find that I can just sharpen my 1/8 inch chisel on my cheap Rider honing guide. That still clamps just fine in the bottom section, so on the very rare occasion I need to sharpen this 1/8 inch chisel, I just use this cheaper honing guide because that works for me. But there we go. Hopefully that was useful to you and you have a clearer understanding of all the different features of the honing guides. One thing I will say, if you're sharpening freehand, don't do it yourself. Just get yourself a £10 honing guide and make yourself a protrusion stop and just sharpen properly. There are a lot of people out there who tell you to do it freehand, but if you're a beginner, trust me, the amount of blades I've seen that are just an absolute dog's dinner. They look like garden trowels. There's just curves all over them, there's facets on them, they just look absolutely dreadful. They're not sharp and they're a nightmare to get back to their original condition. Just make yourself one of these, get yourself a honing guide and just give it a go because your results will be so much more consistent. So if you have any questions, chuck them in the comments below and I look forward to seeing all of the arguments that will arise after I have talked about the subject of sharpening. I'll see you next time.